The screen of my phone lit up again and again that night, each vibration a cruel reminder that the celebration of my life had never truly belonged to me. When I finally opened our family group chat, I was met with an endless stream of photographs, smiling faces, raised glasses, balloons tied to chairs, and a cake lit with candles that spelled out congratulations. But the name written in frosting was not mine. It was my brother's. The sting of betrayal burned sharper than the years I had spent grinding away for a degree that was supposed to change everything. My college graduation had been canceled, and instead of mourning that loss with me, my family had chosen to throw a surprise celebration for him. My name is Emily, and I am 24 years old. For as long as I can remember, I believed that if I worked hard enough, if I was disciplined enough, then recognition would follow. I was wrong. That night, as I scrolled through photos of my brother's party, surrounded by the very people I thought would be devastated with me, I realized how deeply I had misunderstood my place in this family. Before I take you deeper into what happened and why it nearly broke me, let me pause here. If you are watching this, I would love to know where you are tuning in from. Please take a moment to hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Stories like mine are never easy to tell, but by sharing them, I hope someone out there feels less invisible than I did in that moment. The truth is, my graduation had been the one milestone I believed could not be stolen from me. I had spent 4 years sacrificing everything, sleep, friendships, relationships, to reach it. I imagined walking across the stage, the echo of my name filling the auditorium, the weight of the diploma in my hand. It was more than just a piece of paper. It was validation, proof that all my silent battles had been worth something. But then the cancellation notice came, short and impersonal. The world had shifted in ways I could not control, and my dream dissolved overnight. Still, I told myself that my family would be there to lift me up, that they would mourn with me what had been taken away. Instead, they gathered without me. As I sat alone in my small apartment, staring at the images flooding my phone, I felt the full weight of years of being overshadowed. Every snapshot was another reminder that my brother had once again been chosen as the one to celebrate, the one who mattered most. It would be easy to tell you this was just about a canceled ceremony, but it wasn't. It was about a lifetime of moments that had led me to this point. From childhood on, I had been the quiet achiever. I studied late into the night. I earned scholarships. I balanced part-time jobs with a full course load. My family never had to worry about me. I handled myself. My brother, on the other hand, was the golden child. His wins, no matter how small, always sparked gatherings, laughter, applause. I told myself I didn't mind. I convinced myself that one day, when I reached my own pinnacle, they would finally see me. The photos on my phone proved otherwise. I remember staring at an image of my parents clapping as my brother raised his glass. The irony was crushing. I had spent countless hours tutoring him, editing his papers, pushing him through classes he didn't care about. And yet, there they were, celebrating him while I sat in silence. The group chat buzzed with emojis and exclamation marks, hearts and clapping hands, as if the whole world was in on a joke I hadn't been invited to laugh at. At that moment, my identity cracked. I had believed that diligence and effort could carve out a space for me in a family that seemed to overlook me at every turn. But here was the truth, displayed in high-resolution pictures. I wasn't the one worth gathering for. I was the placeholder, the background character in a narrative where my brother was the star. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they thought they were sparing me pain. Maybe they believed I was too busy, too focused, too distant to want to party. Maybe they assumed my resilience was enough to carry me through disappointment without them. But the more I stared at the images, the more hollow those excuses felt. The silence of their absence was louder than any words could have been. Sitting there, I felt the layers of my past press down on me. The birthdays where my achievements were brushed aside, the dinners where my brother's stories dominated while mine went unheard, the constant refrain of, "She'll be fine," whenever my needs arose. I wasn't fine. I was breaking. That night, I lay awake replaying the same thought. What if I simply stopped trying? What if I stopped giving so much of myself to people who gave so little in return? It was a question that terrified me, because my entire identity had been built on the idea that if I was enough, they would love me more. But scrolling through that endless celebration, it became clear my enough would never measure up in their eyes. This was just the beginning of the unraveling, the first tear in the fabric I had so carefully woven around myself. What happened next would shake not only my sense of family, but also my understanding of my own worth. So stay with me. Because if you've ever felt invisible in your own home, if you've ever wondered whether your presence mattered to the very people who should have cherished it most, you'll recognize the storm I was about to walk into. When I look back, it is almost laughable how early the patterns began. I was the quiet child, the one who could sit with crayons or books for hours, while the world around me swirled in noise and chaos. My parents used to say I was easy, as though that was a compliment. In reality, it was their way of acknowledging that I required less from them, that I was not the child who needed tending, soothing, or celebrating. I simply existed in the background, dependable and predictable, while my younger brother drew the spotlight without even trying. In elementary school, I discovered that achievement could be my voice. Every gold star, every perfect report card, every honor roll listing felt like a way of saying, "Look at me, I matter too." I thought grades could balance the scales, that being exceptional on paper would finally draw their eyes toward me. My brother, though, didn't need paper. He had charm. He was the one who cracked jokes at the dinner table, who made teachers laugh even as they reprimanded him, who seemed to gather friends like magnets pick up nails. My parents adored his brightness. They said he had spark. I was the shadow standing nearby, holding certificates no one wanted to frame. By middle school, the contrast had deepened. My brother tried soccer, then baseball, then basketball. Each new sport came with uniforms, practices, and weekend tournaments. My parents rearranged their schedules for every game, their cheers echoing across the field. Meanwhile, my science fair projects and spelling bee victories passed with little acknowledgement. They clapped politely when I won, but their eyes were already on the next match, the next medal my brother might bring home. I pretended not to care. I told myself my worth was in persistence, not applause. High school became the stage where the divide cemented itself. My brother's popularity soared. He was invited everywhere: birthday parties, homecomings, bonfires on the edge of town. He was photographed constantly, his smile wide, his arms slung around friends. I was the studious one, the responsible daughter, staying home to finish essays and prepare for AP exams. When I graduated at the top of my class, my parents took me to a small dinner. They congratulated me between calls to relatives about my brother's latest girlfriend, his latest sports highlight. That evening, as I stared at the candle flickering between us, I understood something painful. My milestones would never compete with his effortless charm. Still, I believed that sacrifice would eventually pay off. I worked part-time jobs through high school, saving every dollar I could to ease the burden of college. While my friends spent weekends at the mall or at the movies, I stocked shelves at a grocery store, folded clothes at a retail shop, and babysat for neighbors. I thought that contributing financially would show my parents how invested I was, how serious I was about building a future. But instead, it seemed to reinforce their belief that I was independent, that I could manage without their support. Meanwhile, my brother floated easily, his needs anticipated, his mistakes quickly forgiven. College became my sanctuary and my prison at once. Away from home, I finally had space to breathe, to define myself without the constant comparisons. But the habits of sacrifice followed me. I lived in small dorm rooms and later cheap apartments, cutting corners and juggling multiple jobs to cover expenses my scholarships didn't reach. I woke at dawn for shifts at the library, worked evenings tutoring classmates, and spent weekends serving coffee to strangers. My peers complained about midterms, but I knew stress on a different scale. Stress meant wondering if my meal plan would stretch until payday, if my used textbooks would be enough to carry me through exams, if my exhaustion would eventually betray me. My family rarely noticed the cracks. Phone calls home were brief, usually revolving around my brother's updates. When I tried to share my struggles, the conversation shifted quickly. I began editing my words, offering only surface-level reports. Things are fine. Classes are good. I thought that by keeping it simple, I might avoid the sting of being dismissed. What hurt more than the lack of attention was the absence of pride. I carried heavy loads, sacrificed countless nights, and still managed to excel academically. But my accomplishments seemed invisible to them. They bragged about my brother's new car, his new friends, his new opportunities. My name surfaced occasionally, often as a side note, a reminder that I was doing well in school. I wanted to scream that I was more than that I was building something monumental against all odds. But screaming was never my style. I endured in silence. The truth is, sacrifice became my identity. I told myself it was noble to push through without recognition, that resilience was its own reward. I convinced myself that the delayed gratification of a diploma would erase all the loneliness, that the image of me walking across a stage would finally shift the family narrative. I imagined the pride on their faces, the applause, the sense that for once it was my turn to be celebrated. That belief carried me through countless sleepless nights and endless to-do lists. But sacrifice without acknowledgement corrodes the spirit. Slowly, the silence ate away at me. Each time I gave more of myself, each time I chose responsibility over joy, I waited for someone to notice. No one ever did. By the time graduation approached, I was brittle, held together by the promise of that one day, that one ceremony. I believed it would heal the ache of years. When the cancellation notice arrived, all those years of sacrifice collapsed in an instant. It was as if someone had pulled the thread that held me together, unraveling everything I had built. The diploma would still exist, but the recognition, the validation, the moment that was supposed to make it real, gone. I tried to swallow the disappointment, to remind myself that many others were facing the same fate. But inside, I was unraveling. What I did not yet know was that the greatest wound was still to come. The photographs in the family chat, the laughter spilling from my phone screen, the knowledge that my family had not only skipped grieving with me, but had chosen to celebrate my brother instead. That was the betrayal that cut deeper than all the rest. Sacrifice had been my language of love, but in that moment, I realized love had not been returned in the same currency. My sacrifices had been taken, absorbed, forgotten, and I was left with nothing but the hollow echo of a lifetime spent waiting to be seen. When the announcement came, it felt like the ground shifted beneath me. It arrived as a sterile email in my inbox, a string of words delivered without emotion. The graduation ceremony was canceled. There were no apologies that could soften the blow, no reassurance that could replace what was being taken. Just an impersonal explanation and the suggestion that degrees would be mailed out in the coming weeks. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours, rereading the words as though they might transform into something else if I looked hard enough. My entire body buzzed with disbelief. For 4 years, I had carried the weight of sacrifice on my back, dragging it through every late-night study session, every double shift at work, every moment I told myself joy could wait until later. And later was supposed to be this, the culmination, the reward, the moment when all the silent labor finally spoke for me. It is difficult to explain the devastation of losing something that cannot be postponed or rescheduled. Birthdays return each year, weddings can be reorganized, but a graduation is singular. It is a point on the timeline that never repeats. Without it, the story feels unfinished, like a book with the last chapter ripped out. I closed the email and opened it again, as though my eyes might have tricked me. But it was always the same. Cancelled. I imagined the auditorium that would now remain empty, the stage that would not be crossed, the cap and gown folded uselessly in plastic. My diploma would arrive in the mail like an afterthought, stripped of ceremony, stripped of meaning. I tried to remind myself that I was not alone. Thousands of students were receiving the same notice, staring at the same impersonal words, grappling with the same hollow ache. But knowing that others shared the loss did not lighten mine. Grief does not shrink simply because it is multiplied. In the days that followed, I found myself in a strange fog. I would wake early out of habit, instinctively reaching for my planner as though there were still exams to study for, presentations to prepare. Then I would remember. It was over, but not in the way it was supposed to be. The momentum I had built for years had collapsed, leaving me weightless and directionless. I drifted through the hours, unable to focus on the tasks in front of me, haunted by the absence of what should have been. It was not just the ceremony itself that hurt. It was what the ceremony represented. It was the vision of my parents in the audience, perhaps clapping politely, perhaps distracted, but at least present. It was the idea of standing in front of them, proof in hand, undeniable evidence that I had accomplished something monumental. Without that stage, I felt robbed of the one opportunity I had to make them look at me, to force them to see me. The days turned into weeks, and I waited for some sign from my family that they understood, that they shared in my grief. I expected calls, messages, some gesture that acknowledged the gravity of the loss, but the silence stretched on, broken only by casual comments about how at least the degree itself still counted, as if the milestone could be reduced to a piece of paper. I tried to keep myself busy, throwing energy into job applications, reorganizing my apartment, anything that might anchor me. But the truth was, I was untethered. The structure of my life had revolved around deadlines and goals, all leading to a climax that no longer existed. Without it, every effort felt meaningless. I had trained for a race whose finish line had been erased. There were moments when I almost convinced myself to let it go. I told myself that resilience was about adapting, about finding pride in the work itself rather than the recognition. I reminded myself that the knowledge I had gained was still mine, that the diploma was still valid even if the ceremony was gone. But deep down, I knew those were hollow comforts. They did nothing to fill the void of what I had lost. Nights were the hardest. I would lie awake in the dark, imagining the ceremony that never happened. I saw myself walking across the stage, the tassel swaying gently as I moved, the applause rising in the auditorium. I imagined the feeling of that moment, the surge of validation, the proof that my sacrifices had not been in vain. And then, as the fantasy unraveled, I was left again in the silence of my room, my body heavy with grief for a memory that did not exist. As the weeks passed, I began to notice the subtle ways the cancellation altered me. My motivation dimmed. The drive that had carried me relentlessly forward seemed to sputter. I felt restless but exhausted, capable of nothing yet haunted by the pressure to move on. Even small tasks became mountains. I would open my laptop to write cover letters and find myself staring at the blank screen for hours. I would begin cleaning the kitchen only to stop halfway, staring out the window at nothing. I told myself I was simply tired, that the years of pushing myself had finally caught up to me, but I knew it was more than that. Something inside me had fractured. For years, I had tied my worth to this milestone, believing it would redeem all the moments of invisibility. Now that it had been stolen, I was left with nothing to hold on to. What I did not know then was that this loss was only the beginning. That as heavy as it felt, the deeper betrayal was yet to come. The ceremony had been cancelled, but I still believed, foolishly, that my family would fill the void, that they would acknowledge the ache and grieve with me. Instead, they chose celebration, but not for me, for him. The day I opened the family group chat and saw the photos of my brother's surprise party was the day the final illusion shattered. The cancelled graduation had left me wounded. The party without me would leave me broken. There is a certain cruelty in watching someone else receive everything you have spent your life working toward. My brother's rise was not sudden, not dramatic. It unfolded gradually, like a tide creeping up the shore until you look down and realize you are already submerged. While I labored through late nights and lonely days, he seemed to coast on a current that always carried him higher. It started small, the way so many things do. A new job offer that everyone praised, even though I knew I had rewritten his resume to make it presentable. A birthday celebration that drew the whole extended family, complete with balloons and speeches, while mine had been reduced to hurried dinners or quick phone calls. Each time I told myself it was fine, that it was natural for families to lean into the excitement of one child while assuming the other was steady enough not to need it. But over time, the pattern grew impossible to ignore. My brother's accomplishments became events. A promotion meant dinners out. A new apartment meant housewarming parties with relatives I had not seen in years. Even minor achievements, a certificate from a short training course, recognition from his boss, were enough to spark gatherings and gifts. I found myself scrolling through group chat photos of these moments, always the observer, never the participant. It was not just that he was celebrated. It was that his celebrations were communal, collective, binding the family together in ways I was never included in. Meanwhile, my milestones passed like shadows. When I finished a difficult internship, there was no mention of it. When I published research that my professors praised, it barely earned a text. I told myself not to be bitter. That comparison was poison, but the bitterness bloomed anyway. Each image of my brother raising a glass carved deeper into the hollow space inside me. What made it worse was the ease of it all. My achievements were built on exhaustion, on sacrifice, on years of grinding through challenges alone. His seemed effortless. He had a way of arriving at opportunities without ever appearing to struggle. Doors opened for him, not because he forced them, but because people wanted him there. My family adored that quality in him. They called it charisma. I called it privilege. It is difficult to explain the slow erosion of self-worth that comes from being perpetually overshadowed. It was not that I wanted my brother to fail. I did not wish him harm. But every time he succeeded, it illuminated how little my own success mattered in comparison. It was as though his light made my accomplishments invisible, erasing them from the family narrative. Holidays were the hardest. Gatherings that should have been shared became showcases for his latest triumphs. Relatives asked about him before they asked about me, their voices brimming with curiosity about his job, his friends, his future plans. When their eyes finally turned to me, the questions were perfunctory, as though ticking a box. "And how are your classes?" "How is work?" Short, polite inquiries that quickly shifted back to him. I learned to keep my answers brief, my voice quiet, my smile fixed. The longer I spoke, the more apparent it became that no one was truly listening. I tried, in those years, to find comfort in the solitude of my own path. I told myself that meaning did not require an audience, that success was not diminished by the lack of applause. I buried myself in my studies, in the careful construction of a future that I believed would one day be undeniable. But even in solitude, the comparisons haunted me. Every photo in the family group chat, every story retold at gatherings I could not attend, reinforced the reality I already knew. He was their favorite. The most painful part was realizing that my sacrifices often served him as well. I was the one who stayed up editing his essays in high school. I was the one who helped him study for exams he had not bothered to prepare for. I was the one who guided him through college applications, who answered his late-night calls when deadlines loomed. And yet, when success came, it was celebrated as his alone. My contributions dissolved into invisibility, taken for granted like background noise. There is a unique loneliness in being both relied upon and overlooked. My family trusted me to carry weight, to solve problems, to hold myself together. But trust, in this sense, was not admiration. It was expectation. They believed I would manage, because I always had. That belief freed them to pour their attention into him. And so, my independence became my curse. I often wonder if things would have been different had I allowed myself to stumble more, to demand attention through failure rather than quietly earning it through resilience. Perhaps if I had made more noise, they would have noticed me. But noise was never in my nature. I equated silence with strength, composure with dignity. I did not realize until too late that silence can also be mistaken for irrelevance. By the time my graduation neared, the imbalance had reached a point of absurdity. Even in conversations about my impending milestone, my brother's name surfaced constantly. He was starting a new job. He was moving into a nicer place. He was being recognized at work. My achievement was acknowledged, yes, but always as an aside, quickly overshadowed by his next step. It was as though the entire family narrative had been rewritten, with him as the protagonist and me relegated to a supporting role. I told myself the graduation ceremony would be different, that one day, at least, could not be stolen, that when I walked across the stage, no one could deny that it was my moment. I clung to that belief with everything I had, pouring years of sacrifice into the vision of that single event. But the ceremony never came, and in the vacuum left by its cancellation, my brother's rise only became more pronounced. The family, eager for celebration, redirected their energy toward him without hesitation. And I, left without my moment, was forced to watch from the sidelines as his spotlight grew brighter. What I did not yet know was how far they were willing to go. That the very celebration I had spent years dreaming of would not only be denied me, but would be handed to him instead. The photos I would later see in the family chat were not just images of a party. They were the culmination of years of erasure, the final proof that no matter how much I gave, I would never be the one they chose to honor. It happened on a Saturday evening, the kind of night that should have been mine. In another version of my life, I would have been dressed in my cap and gown, my heart pounding as my name was called, my feet carrying me across a stage I had earned with every sleepless night, every sacrifice, every quiet victory no one had seen. But instead, I was sitting on my bed, still in the clothes I had worn that morning, staring at the emptiness of my apartment. The silence was suffocating. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, then again, and again. At first, I ignored it, assuming it was some promotional email or a group text from classmates still trying to process their own disappointments. But the vibrations kept coming, insistent, almost mocking. Finally, I reached for the phone and saw the words that would hollow me out in an instant. Family group chat. 67 new messages. I opened it without hesitation, expecting maybe condolences, maybe a shared sense of loss over what had been taken from me. But what I saw instead froze me where I sat. The first image was my brother standing beneath a banner that read, "Congratulations." His smile was wide, effortless, his hands raised in triumph as though the night belonged to him. The next photo was of my parents, arms around him, eyes shining with pride. Then came the flood, plates of food spread across a decorated table, balloons tied to chairs, relatives raising glasses in a toast, a cake lit with candles. Every image screamed of joy, of celebration, of belonging. And every image was a reminder that I was not there, that I had never been meant to be there. I scrolled through them one by one, each picture a knife turning deeper. My brother blowing out candles, my mother clapping, my father laughing, cousins leaning in for selfies, their faces glowing with the kind of happiness that should have been mine to share. They had gathered, all of them, not in sorrow for what I had lost, but in celebration of him. The irony was unbearable. I had spent years believing that my graduation would be the moment my family finally saw me, that they would recognize the depth of my effort, the weight of my sacrifices. Instead, on the night that was supposed to be mine, they chose him. The chat was alive with exclamation points, emojis, messages filled with excitement. There were no mentions of me, no acknowledgement of what the day was supposed to represent. I was not even a shadow in their conversation. I was nothing. I remember staring at a photo of the cake. The frosting was thick, decorated with colorful swirls, and across the top, in bold letters, was written, "We're proud of you." It was not my name written there. It was his. The words that I had waited my entire life to hear, the affirmation I had built myself around, had been given freely to him while I sat alone in a darkened room. Tears blurred my vision, but I kept scrolling, unable to stop myself. It was as though I was watching the erasure of my own existence unfold in real time. Every new photo, every new message in the chat confirmed what I had always feared but never allowed myself to fully admit. In this family, I would never be chosen. The betrayal was layered. It was not just that they had celebrated without me. It was that they had celebrated instead of me. My canceled graduation had not been a moment of mourning for them. It had been an opportunity, a chance to redirect their energy toward the child they had always preferred. My loss had become his gain. I felt something inside me break. It was not a clean fracture, not a sharp snap, but a slow, grinding collapse, like a building crumbling under its own weight. I had built my identity on resilience, on the belief that if I gave enough, worked enough, achieved enough, I would finally be seen. That belief disintegrated in the glow of those photographs. I put the phone down, but the images burned behind my eyes. I lay back on my bed, staring at the ceiling, my body heavy with a grief I could not name. It was more than sadness. It was more than anger. It was the realization that my sacrifices had been for nothing in the only place I had ever truly wanted them to matter. Hours passed, though I did not measure them. The night stretched endlessly, broken only by the occasional buzz of new messages in the chat. They were still celebrating, still sharing photos, still basking in joy while I drowned in silence. I did not have the strength to turn the notifications off. It felt like punishment, and I accepted it, as though enduring their joy was the price of understanding the truth. At some point, I stood and walked to the mirror. My reflection stared back at me, eyes red and swollen, shoulders slumped, face drawn. I hardly recognized myself. I looked like someone emptied, someone erased. I wondered if this was how I had always looked to them, a blur in the background, unremarkable, forgettable. I thought about the years I had spent lifting my brother up, editing his assignments, guiding him through choices, supporting him when he faltered. I thought about the countless times I had set aside my own needs to make space for his. And now, as I stood in the dim light of my apartment, I realized he had become the center while I remained invisible. My labor had built his foundation, and he stood tall upon it while I crumbled. That night was the closest I had ever come to disappearing. Not physically, but emotionally. I felt myself slipping away, the edges of my identity dissolving into the shadows. If my family could erase me so completely on the day that should have defined me, then what was left of me at all? I crawled back into bed and pulled the covers over my head, clutching my phone to my chest as though holding it might anchor me. The group chat buzzed again, one final image flashing across the screen before sleep claimed me. My family, all of them, crowded together around my brother, their faces glowing, their arms linked. A family portrait without me. The morning after the party, I woke to the weight of exhaustion pressing down on me. My phone was still on the nightstand, its screen dark now, though I knew more messages waited inside, more fragments of a night that had not belonged to me. For a moment, I lay perfectly still, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that the ache in my chest was only a dream I had carried from the night before. But reality settled in quickly, sharp and undeniable. The party had happened, the photos were real, and my family had chosen to celebrate him instead of grieving with me. I dragged myself out of bed, my body heavy, as though grief had seeped into my bones. I moved through the motions of the morning, making coffee I could not bring myself to drink, standing under the shower until the water ran cold, staring blankly at my reflection in the mirror. My face looked pale, almost ghostly, as if part of me had already faded. The hours blurred together. I tried to distract myself with chores, with television playing in the background, with the hum of meaningless activity, but the images would not leave me. They replayed in my mind on an endless loop, my brother blowing out candles, my parents smiling at his side, the group photo with everyone gathered together. Each time the memories surfaced, they cut deeper, until it felt as though my own body was betraying me with every heartbeat. That night, sleep refused to come. I lay awake, shifting beneath the covers, staring at the glow of the clock as the hours dragged by. My mind raced through every memory I had of being overlooked, of being silenced, of being told without words that I did not matter. The pattern stretched back so far, it was impossible to find a beginning. It was not just this night, not just this party. It was my life. I remembered birthdays where I watched my brother tear open gifts while mine were small, practical, easily forgotten. I remembered holidays where relatives crowded around him, laughing at his jokes, while my stories fell into silence. I remembered standing beside him in family photos, my smile strained, my presence an afterthought. All those moments had built to this, the ultimate confirmation that I was never meant to be the one they celebrated. The bitterness that rose inside me was sharp, corrosive. I thought of all the times I had carried responsibility quietly, never asking for recognition, always believing that one day it would come. I thought of the sacrifices I had made for my family, for my brother, for everyone but myself. And now, staring into the darkness, I realized those sacrifices had been swallowed whole, unacknowledged, unappreciated, forgotten. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. The silence of my apartment swallowed me, leaving only the sound of my own shallow breaths. I pressed my fists into the mattress, trying to anchor myself against the storm inside me. Anger and grief clashed in waves, each one pulling me deeper into despair. By dawn, I had not slept at all. My body trembled with exhaustion. My eyes burned from tears I had not even noticed spilling through the night. I rose from bed and walked aimlessly through my apartment, pacing from room to room, unable to sit still. Every surface felt unfamiliar, as though I had been displaced from my own life. I tried to eat, but food turned to ash in my mouth. I tried to read, but the words swam on the page, meaningless. Even the sound of music felt unbearable, as though it mocked the silence I carried inside. Days slipped by in this haze, each one indistinguishable from the last. I stopped answering messages, stopped returning calls. My phone sat untouched on the counter, its screen lighting up with notifications I refused to read. I could not bear the thought of seeing another photo, another reminder of the celebration I had been excluded from. Instead, I withdrew further, curling inward until the world outside seemed distant, unreachable. My apartment became both a cage and a refuge, a place where no one could see me, but also where no one cared to look. I told myself that invisibility was safer than the pain of being ignored. But the loneliness hollowed me out, leaving nothing but echoes where my sense of self had once been. At night, the insomnia worsened. I lay awake for hours, replaying not just the party but my entire life, each memory another piece of evidence in the case against me. I questioned everything, my worth, my choices, even my identity. If my own family could erase me so easily, what did that say about who I was? What did that say about the life I had built? I began to imagine erasing myself entirely, slipping quietly out of the roles I had filled, disappearing from the expectations that weighed me down. The thought frightened me, but it also felt strangely comforting. To stop striving, to stop sacrificing, to stop waiting for recognition that would never come. There was a certain peace in that possibility. But even as I considered it, a part of me clung desperately to the hope that something might change, that maybe they would notice my absence, that maybe they would reach out with the love I had craved for so long. That hope was fragile, but it kept me from breaking completely. It was the thin thread I wrapped around myself as I lay awake, whispering promises into the dark that maybe, just maybe, I still mattered. The breaking point was not a single moment, but a series of fractures, each one weakening me further until I could barely hold myself together. It was the accumulation of silence, of neglect, of betrayal. By the time I reached the end of that week, I was no longer the person I had been. I was something hollow, something raw, something undone. And yet, somewhere in the wreckage, a quiet realization stirred. If my family would never give me the recognition I sought, then perhaps I had to stop waiting for it. Perhaps I had to find another way to define myself, to rebuild from the pieces left scattered on the floor. I was not ready to act on that realization yet. At the breaking point, all I could do was survive the shattering. But survival, I would later learn, was its own kind of rebellion. And it was the first step toward a future I could not yet imagine. Confrontation was never in my nature. For most of my life, I learned to swallow words, to bury resentment, to carry the weight of silence as if it were strength. But silence corrodes, and mine had reached a point where it threatened to consume me completely. After nights of sleeplessness and days blurred by grief, something inside me shifted. The pain that had once paralyzed me began to harden into resolve. I could no longer carry it alone. When I finally decided to face my family, it was not a dramatic moment of courage, but a quiet necessity, like gasping for air after being underwater too long. My hands shook as I prepared myself, my thoughts tangled and jagged, but beneath the trembling, there was clarity. I needed to tell them. I needed to force them to see me, even if only for once. The meeting was arranged casually, as though nothing had fractured, as though everything was still intact. We sat together in a room that had held countless family gatherings before. Birthdays, holidays, ordinary dinners. The walls carried echoes of laughter that had rarely been mine, and now those same walls closed in around me as I braced myself to speak truths I had held for too long. I began slowly, carefully, my voice unsteady at first. I laid out the pattern of my life as I had lived it, the sacrifices, the invisibility, the moments when my achievements had been brushed aside while my brother's smallest victories became occasions for celebration. I spoke of the canceled graduation, of the way the moment I had worked for had dissolved without acknowledgement. And then, finally, I spoke of the night of the party, the flood of images on my phone, the unbearable realization that they had chosen joy for him instead of grief for me. The words poured out, raw and unfiltered. Years of silence unraveled in a torrent I could no longer contain. I spoke of birthdays spent in the shadows, of holidays where I felt like a guest in my own family, of the countless times I had been told without words that I was not the one they cherished. I described the ache of scrolling through the photos of that night, each one proof of my erasure, each one confirming what I had always feared, that I would never be enough for them. As I spoke, I searched their faces for signs of recognition, for flickers of remorse or understanding, but what I saw instead was discomfort, defensiveness, confusion. Their eyes shifted, their bodies stiffened, as though my truth were an accusation too heavy to bear. The silence between us grew sharp, cutting deeper than any denial could. In that silence, I felt the familiar weight of invisibility pressing down again. Even in the moment when I finally voiced the pain I had carried for years, I remained unseen. My words hovered in the air, but they did not land where I needed them to. Instead, they fell into the cracks of indifference that had always separated us. The confrontation did not end in reconciliation, nor in explosive argument. It ended in the same way most things in my family did, with avoidance. They shifted the subject, redirected the tension, brushed aside the rawness of my confession as though it were inconvenient, temporary, exaggerated. I had ripped myself open before them, and they responded with the same silence that had defined my life. Walking away from that room, I felt both heavier and lighter. Heavier because the confrontation had not brought the relief I craved. Lighter because at least the words were no longer festering inside me. I had spoken them aloud, broken the seal of silence, and in doing so, I had claimed something for myself. Even if they refused to see me, I had finally seen myself. The hours after the confrontation were filled with a strange stillness. I replayed everything in my mind, questioning whether I had said too much, whether I had been unfair, whether I had demanded too much from people who were simply incapable of giving more. But no amount of doubt could erase the truth. I had been invisible in my own family, and speaking it aloud did not make it any less real. That night, back in the solitude of my apartment, I sat in the dark with a notebook in my lap. For years, I had written lists of goals, of deadlines, of tasks to complete. But this time, I wrote something different. I wrote down every moment I could remember of being overlooked, every instance where I had swallowed the sting of being ignored. The list grew longer than I expected, page after page filled with memories I had tried to bury. By the time I stopped, my hand ached, my eyes blurred, but my chest felt lighter. Seeing it all laid out before me confirmed what I had always known, but had doubted in moments of weakness. It was not my imagination. The pattern was real. The erasure was real. And I had been carrying it alone for too long. The confrontation had not healed me, but it had given me a strange kind of strength. It had forced me to acknowledge that waiting for their validation was a path that only led to pain. If they could not see me when I laid myself bare, then perhaps they never would. For the first time, I began to consider the possibility of stepping outside of their narrative entirely, of building a life that was not tethered to their recognition, of finding worth in places they could not touch. The thought was terrifying, like standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into the unknown. But it was also liberating. For so long, I had been defined by what I lacked in their eyes. Perhaps it was time to define myself by what I could create for my own. The breaking point had left me raw, but the confrontation marked a turning. It was the moment I stopped waiting for them to save me, stopped believing that they would ever give me what I needed. The wound was still open, the pain still sharp, but beneath it all, a seed of defiance had been planted. I did not know then what it would grow into. I only knew that silence had lost its grip on me. And though their silence remained, mine had ended. In the days after I confronted my family, the silence that followed was deafening. There were no phone calls, no messages, no acknowledgments of the words I had forced into the open. I had expected distance, perhaps anger, but what I received instead was absence, a void even larger than the one I had lived in before. They did not fight me. They did not engage. They simply disappeared into themselves, leaving me suspended in the aftermath of truths that had no place to land. But the fallout did not remain contained within the walls of my family. Slowly, it began to leak into the edges of my life, creeping into conversations with acquaintances, glances from relatives, questions I could not bring myself to answer. My invisibility within my home had transformed into a different kind of visibility outside of it. People noticed now, not my achievements or my efforts, but the fracture itself. The first signs came from extended relatives, cousins and aunts, whose involvement in my life had always been sporadic at best. They had been at the party, of course, their faces stamped into the photos I had scrolled through with tears in my eyes. Some of them sent messages later, short and cautious, the kind that barely skim the surface of concern. Others said nothing at all. Their silence felt like complicity, an unspoken agreement to preserve the image of unity at the expense of truth. I felt their eyes on me during gatherings, their hesitation when I entered a room. It was as though I had become the embodiment of discomfort, the reminder of something everyone preferred not to acknowledge. My presence was no longer ignored in the way it had once been. Now it was watched, measured, weighed against their unease. I had shifted from invisible to inconvenient, and in some ways, that felt even worse. Friends and classmates noticed too. They asked why there had been no celebration for my graduation, why my family had not organized something to honor the milestone. I struggled to find words, to offer explanations that did not strip me bare. I muttered vague excuses about timing, about circumstances, about the canceled ceremony itself, but I knew the truth hovered behind my hesitation, sensed in the way their expressions shifted from curiosity to pity. The pity was unbearable. I had spent my entire life striving to appear strong, composed, untouchable in my resilience. Now, I felt exposed, cracked open by the weight of betrayal that seemed to follow me everywhere. People looked at me differently, not with admiration for what I had endured, but with sorrow for what I had lost. It made me want to retreat further, to hide away from the eyes that mirrored back the pain I already carried. At work, even colleagues noticed. Someone asked why I had not posted photos from graduation, why there had been no celebration shared online. The question was casual, harmless, but it pierced me all the same. Social media was filled with images of my peers in their caps and gowns, smiling despite the cancellations, staging their own versions of the ceremonies they had been denied. I had nothing to show, nothing to share. My silence online mirrored the silence in my home, and both spoke volumes I wished I could silence. The weight of social fallout was not just external, but internal. I began to doubt myself more deeply, to question whether I had been selfish in my confrontation, whether I had demanded too much from people incapable of giving. The whispers of guilt grew louder, fueled by the uneasy stares and half-hearted questions of those around me. I wondered if I had become the villain in a story I had once told myself I was the victim of. And yet, beneath the doubt, there was still clarity. I knew what I had lived. I knew the years of erasure, the patterns that had shaped me, the betrayal of that night. No amount of silence or avoidance could erase those truths. The fallout only highlighted them further, exposing the cracks not just within my family, but in the way I had constructed my entire identity around their approval. There were moments, though, when the weight of it nearly broke me. Walking into a room and feeling the hush that followed, scrolling through social media and seeing celebrations I could not claim. answering questions with lies that felt heavy on my tongue. It all accumulated until I could barely carry myself through the day. I felt fractured in every direction, torn between the part of me that still longed for reconciliation and the part of me that knew it might never come. Nights were the worst. Alone in my apartment, I replayed the confrontation in my mind, analyzing every word, every expression, every silence. I wondered what they said about me when I was not there, how they explained my absence to others, whether they painted me as bitter, ungrateful, fragile. I imagined the narratives being spun without me, and I hated how powerless I felt to shape them. The fallout extended even into small, ordinary moments. At the grocery store, I caught sight of my reflection in the freezer doors, my shoulders hunched, my eyes dull. I barely recognized the person staring back. She looked tired, defeated, worn down by battles no one else could see. At the coffee shop, I overheard a group of students talking about their families, about support and celebrations, and the sound of their laughter felt like salt on an open wound. Still, there was a strange clarity in the fallout. As painful as it was, it stripped away the illusions I had clung to for so long. I could no longer pretend that my family would change if I just worked harder, achieved more, sacrificed further. Their silence, their avoidance, their refusal to acknowledge my truth was evidence enough. I was no longer invisible by accident. I was invisible by design, and admitting that allowed me to finally see the futility of waiting for them to choose me. The social fallout did not heal me, but it sharpened me. Each awkward question, each pitying look, each silence forced me to confront not just what I had lost, but what I had been chasing all along. Approval, validation, belonging. Things that had never truly been mine to begin with. By the end of those weeks, I felt raw, exposed, stripped of everything I had once used to shield myself. But in that rawness, a faint glimmer of strength began to emerge. If the world now saw me as broken, perhaps it was because I was finally allowing the truth to show. And maybe, just maybe, that truth was the first step toward building a life that no longer depended on being chosen by those who had never chosen me at all. Recovery did not arrive in a single moment. There was no dramatic revelation, no sudden rush of peace that erased the pain of everything I had endured. Instead, it came in fragments, slow and uneven, like pieces of glass scattered across a floor. Each step forward was small, sometimes imperceptible. But eventually I began to notice that the weight pressing on my chest was not as crushing as it had once been. The first step was admitting how deep the wound truly was. For so long, I had minimized it, convincing myself that my family's neglect was survivable, that my strength was proof I did not need their presence. But in the stillness after the confrontation, when the fallout left me more isolated than ever, I could no longer deny how much it had shaped me. I had lived my life as though love was a prize to be earned, bending myself into achievements and responsibilities that were never enough. The emptiness that followed me was not a weakness. It was the inevitable result of starving for something that had never been freely given. Therapy became my anchor. At first, I resisted it, telling myself I could navigate this alone, that I did not want to waste time revisiting wounds that already felt too raw. But the silence of my apartment, the sleepless nights filled with looping thoughts, the weight of social fallout, it all became unbearable. Sitting across from someone who listened without judgment was disorienting in the beginning. I had grown so accustomed to being dismissed or overshadowed that the act of being heard felt almost foreign. Slowly, I began to open the door to parts of myself I had locked away. The process was messy. I uncovered anger I had never allowed myself to express, grief that had calcified beneath years of pretending I was fine, shame that clung to me like a second skin. There were sessions where I could barely speak, where my throat tightened and my chest ached from the effort of holding everything in. And there were others where words spilled out of me in torrents, overwhelming in their release. Each session left me exhausted, but it also left me lighter, as though I had dropped a stone I had been carrying for years. Outside of therapy, I began to rebuild my life in small, deliberate ways. I forced myself to create routines that grounded me, even when I did not feel like moving. Morning walks became a ritual, a way of reminding myself that the world existed beyond the confines of my pain. I cooked meals for myself, not out of necessity, but as an act of care, proof that I deserved to be nourished. I started reading again, letting the words of others remind me that stories could hold both suffering and redemption. Isolation had once felt like punishment, but slowly, I began to reframe it as opportunity. Without the constant pull of my family's expectations or the weight of chasing their approval, I had space to ask questions I had avoided for years. Who was I outside of achievement? What did I value when no one else was watching? What kind of connections did I want to build, not out of obligation, but out of genuine desire? The answers did not arrive all at once, but the act of asking felt like a quiet rebellion against the patterns that had defined me. There were setbacks, of course, days when the loneliness pressed down so hard I could barely breathe. Nights when I replayed the betrayal over and over, convincing myself that perhaps it had been my fault all along. But I learned to recognize those spirals as part of the process rather than evidence of failure. Healing was not linear, and I reminded myself of that constantly. Each time I stumbled, I forced myself to get back up, even if it meant crawling through the heaviness. I began to notice changes in the way I carried myself. My shoulders, once perpetually hunched, began to relax. My voice, once tentative, grew steadier when I spoke. I caught glimpses of myself in mirrors and windows and saw not just the exhaustion etched into my features, but also a resilience that had been buried under years of neglect. I was scarred, yes, but the scars were proof that I had survived. The world outside shifted too. Friends who had once been peripheral in my life began to step closer, filling spaces I had not realized were empty. Their care was simple, not wrapped in grand gestures but in consistency, in the quiet presence of people who showed up without being asked. For the first time, I allowed myself to accept that care without guilt. I did not have to earn it. I did not have to prove myself worthy. It was given freely, and that was enough. Even within the silence of my family, I found clarity. Their absence was no longer a wound I obsessed over, but a truth I could accept. They had shown me who they were, over and over, and it was not my responsibility to rewrite the story. I could grieve what I had lost without clinging to the hope that they would suddenly become what I needed them to be. That acceptance did not erase the pain, but it loosened its grip. It allowed me to breathe in ways I had not thought possible. As the weeks turned into months, I realized that rebuilding myself was not about becoming unbreakable. It was about learning to live with the fractures, to see them not as evidence of weakness, but as reminders of survival. My story was no longer about erasure, no longer about chasing validation in places it could not be found. It was about finding worth within myself, about reclaiming the pieces that had been buried under years of longing. There were still days when the ache returned, when the memories clawed at me with their sharp edges. But even in those moments, I felt a difference. The ache no longer consumed me. It no longer dictated every breath, every thought, every choice. It was part of me, but it was not all of me. Rebuilding myself was not about erasing the past. It was about carrying it differently, with less shame and more honesty. It was about acknowledging the betrayal, the invisibility, the fallout, without letting them define the entirety of my existence. It was about recognizing that the love I had been chasing was never mine to begin with, and that I could still create something meaningful, something true, from the ashes of what had been denied to me. By the time I reached that realization, I knew I was not healed, not fully, but I was healing, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. The idea of family had always been rigid for me, bound tightly by blood and obligation. It was a word that carried weight, history, and expectations I could never quite fulfill. I had believed for most of my life that no matter how much distance existed between us, no matter how many times I felt invisible, I was tied to them in ways I could never escape. But after everything that had happened, after the silence that followed my most vulnerable moments, I began to see family differently. Family was not a guarantee. It was not the people who shared your last name or your childhood home. It was not the ones who appeared in old photographs or who showed up on holiday cards. Family, I realized, was defined by presence, by choice, by those who decided to stand beside you when the weight of the world pressed down hardest. That realization did not come all at once. It was shaped in countless small moments. A friend dropping off groceries without being asked. A colleague checking in daily just to remind me I mattered. A neighbor knocking on my door to share leftovers, insisting I eat something warm. These gestures may have seemed ordinary on the surface, but to me they were monumental. They were proof that I was not as alone as I had once believed. Slowly, I allowed myself to receive without guilt. For years, I had believed that care had to be earned, that love was conditional, tethered to achievement or performance. But these new bonds proved otherwise. They taught me that affection could exist simply because I was human, simply because I deserved it. That shift was disorienting at first, but it was also liberating. I built a circle around me, not of relatives, but of chosen family. They were the people who showed up consistently, who celebrated my small victories, and sat with me in the heaviness of my losses. They were not bound to me by obligation, and yet their loyalty ran deeper than anything I had experienced before. There was power in that. There was healing in that. In their presence, I began to grow differently. I no longer measured my worth by how hard I worked or how perfectly I performed. I no longer begged for scraps of attention or twisted myself into someone more palatable just to be acknowledged. Instead, I embraced authenticity, even when it felt raw, even when it felt messy. For the first time, I allowed myself to exist without apology. The freedom in that space was unlike anything I had known. I laughed more freely, without the echo of comparison in my mind. I rested without guilt, understanding that my value was not diminished by stillness. I pursued passions that had been buried under years of striving, writing, painting, walking without a destination. These were not acts of achievement, but of self-expression, of living for myself rather than for the approval of others. Through this process, I began to understand that forgiveness was not for them, but for me. Holding on to resentment kept me tethered to the very wounds I was trying to heal. Letting go did not mean excusing the neglect, nor did it mean inviting those patterns back into my life. It meant choosing peace over bitterness. It meant acknowledging that I could not rewrite the past, but I could decide how much of it would define my future. In time, I reached a place where the ache in my chest no longer felt like a constant companion. It surfaced occasionally, in quiet moments when memories stirred, but it no longer consumed me. The betrayal had shaped me, yes, but it had not destroyed me. Instead, it had forced me to rebuild with stronger foundations. Ones rooted not in desperation for approval, but in self-respect and genuine connection. Looking back, I realized that the collapse of what I thought was my family had given me something unexpected. It gave me clarity. It gave me the freedom to stop chasing what was never mine to begin with. It gave me space to redefine love and belonging on my own terms. And in that freedom, I discovered a resilience I never knew I had. Now, when I think of family, I do not picture the people who ignored my absence or turned celebrations into reminders of where I did not belong. I picture the friend who stayed up with me through sleepless nights, the mentor who reminded me of my worth, the community I allowed myself to build from scratch. They are not bound to me by blood, but they are bound by something stronger. Choice. They chose me, and I chose them. That is the beauty of rebuilding. It strips away illusions and reveals truths we spend years avoiding. The truth was painful, yes, but it also opened the door to something better. I may have lost the family I thought I had, but I gained a family that sees me, values me, and shows up without condition. And perhaps most importantly, I gained myself. For years, I had been chasing validation, twisting into shapes that might earn a sliver of love. But standing here now, I know I no longer need to prove my worth. I no longer need to beg for attention. I am enough as I am. My scars tell a story not of defeat, but of survival. My voice, once silenced by comparison, now carries strength born from truth. If there is anything I want to leave behind from this journey, it is the reminder that we are not defined by those who fail to love us. We are defined by how we choose to rise, by the bonds we create, by the courage to keep opening ourselves even when the world has left us bleeding. Family is not always given. Sometimes it is built, and sometimes that is the most beautiful kind of family of all. So, if you are watching this now, I hope my story reminds you that healing is possible, even in the aftermath of betrayal. I hope it encourages you to find or create the family you deserve, to embrace the worth that has always been inside you, even if others failed to see it. And if you made it this far, I want to thank you. Your presence here matters to me more than you know. If you leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel, I wish you nothing but light, healing, and love in your own journey. May you find the strength to redefine what family means for you, and may you always remember that you are enough exactly as you are.